Usually, as Hala says, it's much more interesting to listen to political predictions and things like that. Obviously, I'm not going to single-handedly put culture back on the Middle East agenda with only 2 books. But what I'm trying to point out, and I'm taking the advantage of these 2 books to say how little's been written in a systematic way to bring culture into the discussions. And today I'll talk about why that's the case and why I think what I think are the consequences of not including it very much. And then I'll relate the problem to the 2 books that Hala mentioned that were published in 2007 and 2009. The Political Culture of Leadership in the Middle East is coming out in paperback in the fall, and I don't really encourage anybody to read it who isn't really fascinated by the United Arab Emirates. But the other one is a general audience book, which is called Simple Gestures: A Cultural Journey into the Middle East, and that came out in last November. Simple Gestures will be available outside if you want to get it. So American officials seem very belatedly to have recognized that efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan were very much hampered by our lack of understanding of the local cultures there. And it's pretty obvious that Americans are ignorant of the cultures of the Middle East, and perhaps even worse, they have very strong opinions about them without much reliable information. And I can think of at least 3 mistakes we made in Afghanistan because of our ignorance of Afghan history and culture. The first is our insistence on a centralized instead of a decentralized government. And I recommend Ahmed Rashid's book, Descent into Chaos, if you want to read about details about how we arm-twisted members of the constitutional lawyer Jirga that was held in December 2003 that approved this centralized system of government. What we lost by doing so on many levels was an Afghan tradition of local initiative by forcing all the resources and services to pass through the central bureaucracy. And President Karzai now controls all the provincial budgets and the appointments of governors. The second mistake, I think, was our insistence on a presidential form of government instead of one that balanced presidential power with a prime minister. And tribal societies are known for a long time for apportioning power so that no one group becomes too strong. And the third point is in the writing of a constitution, we required a lot of provisions that applied to our ideas of democracy without fully understanding the implications of the Islamic clause that was added by the Afghans. And according to this clause, any principle of the Constitution can be invalidated if it contradicts Islam. For example, the provision that calls for the equality of all citizens under the law contradicts Sharia, personal status law, which treats men and women unequally. Some would say the laws treat them equitably according to their social roles, but it doesn't treat them equally, so there's a contradiction with the Constitution. Saddam Hussein famously made my point when he said, "Constitutions are made by men to be torn up by other men," meaning that constitutions as the creation of human beings don't have the force of laws handed down by God. The U.S. military, thinking it dealt well with the cultural issue in Iraq by engaging Sunni tribes, is now inserting culture into training of troops before they go overseas to Afghanistan. This sensitivity training is supposed to win the hearts and minds of local people. And although it's good, and I don't want to complain too much about the American military becoming more aware of cultural factors affecting their mission, it's very hard to think that they can get it right. An example of the difficulty can be seen in an article in Vanity Fair about a year ago by Sebastian Junger, who has a new book out too. Sebastian, who was embedded with troops in Afghanistan, describes the American soldiers he observed as being very sensitive to Afghans. Yet he illustrates his article with 2 pictures of burly American soldiers, naked to the waist with big tattoos saying infidel on them, shaking hands with very perplexed-looking villagers. He explains that it was a hot day and the Americans were resting when the Afghans came along. But neither he nor the soldiers seemed to have any idea of how insulting it would be to Afghans to be greeted by half-naked men. It's a small matter, but it shows how difficult it is to master the details of culture. Even when we recognize our ignorance of culture, it's difficult to know where to turn for reliable information. There are no longer anthropologists, as in the old days, like Margaret Mead or Ruth Benedict, trying to communicate culture to the general public. And there are at least 4 reasons anthropologists don't write for the general public. And the first is that they worry, and rightly so, about oversimplification, reducing cultural principles to a point where they become virtually meaningless. And second, many of them distrust government to the extent that they won't provide information that might make them complicit in a military occupation. This is a very prevalent view among anthropologists. And third, Edward Said's critiques of early Orientalist writings have made many Western scholars very self-conscious about explaining the region. And finally, the fashion in scholarship now is to focus on universal values, or the similarities of human needs and values rather than on their differences. The assumption being, for example, that every society should be wanting to move toward liberal democracy, for example, as a political system. And it's no longer considered appropriate to frame culture in the relativist terms, where each society was measured against its own standards and values. So consequently, anthropologists now write mostly for themselves and show little interest in helping policymakers or the public become better informed. Is the mass media any better? Well, recently, Hugh Pope, I think he spoke here, in presenting his recent book, it was called Dining with Al-Qaeda, makes 2 very important points about reporting on the Middle East. One is that the Middle East was so far off our radar screens before 9/11 that few reporters found it worthwhile to develop expertise in the area. It was kind of a dumping ground for poor reporters. His second point was that the news media adjusts its priorities to what it thinks Americans want to hear, and even goes so far as to select facts and stories to reinforce the public's assumptions. Pope says in his book, "Now I see that reporters and editors in most countries, very much including the U.S., are reluctant to stray far from national preconceptions." An Iranian-American professor named Fatma Kashvaris, I probably don't... Can you say it again first?
Kashvaris.
Okay. In a book called Jasmine and Stars, also complains about the distortions in the literature coming out now. And she calls it the new Orientalism, where the Middle East is portrayed as either hopelessly backward or overly exotic. But this time violence becomes one of the typical characteristics. Whatever her name is talking is talking about books like The Kite Runner, Reading Lolita in Tehran, 9 Parts of Desire, and The Bookseller of Kabul, all written by authors who seem credible because they come from the region or they've spent considerable time there. These writers, she says, position all evil on the side of the East and all good on the side of the West. And the books stay on bestseller lists because they reinforce American images of the region and make it easier for them to fight wars that bring the benefits of the West to the uncivilized East. An Egyptian-American scholar, local scholar, Mervet Hatem, in her presidential address to the Middle East Studies Association, adds a slightly different perspective when she complains that the critical work done by students of Middle East women's studies to replace the cliched Orientalist views of Muslim women has not spilled into the more conservative disciplines of political science or economics, whose discussions of development, the war on terror, and absence of democracy recycle the old view of women as victims of Islamic societies, needing rescue by white men and women from the oppression of their culture and or brown Muslim men. She says the field of Middle East studies has even been accused of not providing a critical enough understanding of the evilness of the Islamist threat. In particular, she criticizes the Arab authors of the UNDP's Arab Human Development Report for their unapologetic acceptance of the superiority of the West and an equally unequivocal embrace of the backwardness of the East. She says, unfortunately, this model has been internalized by the intellectual elites of the region, so it means we're faced with the overwhelming task of foiling these Orientalist views before we can even begin to analyze the development crises in the region. So we in the West tend to listen to these westernized Arabs because their English is good and because they say what we want to hear and they speak in the kind of language we understand. But many local women's movements in countries of the Middle East, including Syria and Saudi Arabia in particular, are organizing to take back, as the women say, the initiative from the westernized Arabs that don't represent their views. I'm spending a lot of time on this just to say that there's a whole underground discomfort with this idea of not looking enough into culture and in the kind of distortions that are coming out. But I want to say that the main reason I wrote Simple Gestures in the Uae Book was to look for ways to put culture gently back on the agenda. The first problem, of course, was the very vagueness of the concept of culture. People use it in so many different ways, as a country's arts and crafts, its traditional rituals, or its basic manners and refinements. None of this is basically what I had in mind in writing these two books. So I had to start with my own definition that would clarify the use of the term. And I want to say that I don't think my definition is so different from anthropologists generally. So for me, culture is a conceptual framework, a worldview, you could say, that helps people organize their lives and guides their behavior. In other words, culture is the shared expectations and assumptions that help people make sense of their world and communicate better with one another. There are many ways of looking at culture, of course, but for me the best way is to watch people interacting with one another. And from these interactions, it soon becomes apparent that there are reasonably consistent understandings that frame their world. It's very much the way language frames the world of communication. Clifford Geertz famously described the process of studying culture more eloquently when he said anthropologists approach culture by hoping to find in the little what eludes them in the large, by stumbling upon general truths while sorting through special cases. In other words, insights come by sifting through the daily encounters of local people. In my book, The Political Culture of Leadership in the UAE, the encounters of ruling elites are described mainly in British reports and documents of the period. And of course, these admittedly have their limitations. But still, by sifting through the reports, it's possible to find characteristic patterns of rule in the 7 emirates over the 200 years that I studied them. In the other book, Simple Gestures, the patterns appear in the anecdotes of my own encounters with local people in 8 different countries over the 40 years I worked or lived there. The anecdotes, of course, can be read on many different levels, and I assume that readers will. They can read them as pure description or with deeper meanings, but some readers will be able to pick out the patterns that characterize these cultures, as well as some of the characteristic American ways of behaving that come out of my reactions to these situations. So let me talk first about the Uae Book. Most writing on the Persian-Arabian Gulf looks narrowly at the region's economic and strategic interests, mainly as these affect foreigners. The countries are described as rentier states, as if the overwhelming influence on governance was the discovery of oil and the revenues that flowed from it. Oil is undeniably a major factor in those areas, but well before oil, leaders in the region showed characteristic patterns of governing that continued long after its discovery. My book covers a wide range of these patterns, but for reasons of time, I'll talk only about one aspect of governing, the influence of women, since it's the least well known in a society where women appear virtually invisible. Whatever record there may be of women's political activities over these 200 years is largely erased, or at best remains only in the memories of a few people. Even now, official UAE documents, such as ruling family trees, never show women. And when I tried to ask even educated Emirati men about women and their families, they often refused to give me their names. It took several years of talking informally to women who do reveal that kind of information before I could fill in most of the blanks in the trees and hear the stories of women's involvement in political life. And then it took some creative analysis to understand the extent to which rulers' strategies were reflected in their relationships with women. One institution of importance was, of course, marriage, and almost every marriage in the ruling families advanced a political goal of some kind. A good example was the late Sheikh Zayed of Abu Dhabi, whose marriages show shifting interests over several decades. One of his first marriages, and by far the longest, was to a cousin, which was the ideal first marriage that hopefully produces eldest sons with converging bloodlines. And in fact, this woman, Hassa, is the mother of the current ruler. Zayed was content with only this one wife for many years, despite the fact that she had many miscarriages and bore only one son. But in the second phase, in the early 50s, Zayed became the ruler's representative in the Western province, and then he began marrying women from inland tribes whose support he needed against Saudi efforts to control the oil-rich Baremi oasis. Then around 1958, when his popular older brother Hazza died, and Zayed became the likely candidate to succeed another brother, he dramatically increased the number of women he married. These marriages were calculated to bring him wide support in the succession and produce children who would support him if he came to power. In the history of the UAE, there's almost a generalization you can make that the more sons a ruler had, the longer and more powerful his rule was likely to be, while the more brothers he had, the more contentious his rule was likely to be, and the shorter its duration. So all else being equal, this insight helps to explain the cycles of internal conflict that arose as rulers with many sons expanded their territories and power, thereby making the succession all the more desirable and, in the end, more contentious as their sons came and competed with one another for the power. When Zayed finally became ruler, he immediately co-opted the main challenging lineage from his family, his cousins, the Beni Muhammad, by marrying his children to their children and by giving them influential positions. Once his rule became secure, he began consolidating all of the power in his own descendants by marrying his children and grandchildren in his own lineage or to non-competing maternal relatives. Even today, in what normally is a very secretive society, marriages still provide public evidence of important political strategies. Two recent marriages, for example, indicate where the fault lines run in the Abu Dhabi ruling family. And not surprisingly, the two most important ones divide competing mother blocks of Sayyid's sons. In one recent marriage, the current ruler, Khalifa, and Zayd's second son, Sultan, both single sons of their mothers, consolidated their interests by marrying their children. This marriage counterbalanced the strong influence of Zayd's third son, Muhammad, the crown prince, who has 5 influential brothers and a powerful mother. And of course, Muhammad soon responded by marrying his child to a member of the competing Beni Muhammad lineage, where the ruler Khalifa already had depth through his maternal relatives. It's a complicated story, and I won't go on much with it, but once you start following them, the marriages become a very reliable way of knowing what's going on. The women were not just pawns in these royal marriages, and their links to the tribal groups outside the ruling families gave all kinds of strategic advantage to the rulers. As members of informal information networks when they sat around and talked with one another, they were able to keep their husbands and sons well informed outside the tribal limits, especially for critical legal cases. They brought mediators to resolve tribal disputes and extra military support whenever it was needed. And many were businesswomen in their own right. The mother and grandmother of the present Sheikh of Dubai, probably he owes his inheritance to them. These two women owned a good portion of the city of Dubai and had open audiences that men attended for their advice. One ruler's wife put on men's clothes and led her tribe against the enemies of her husband when she became frustrated by their weak response. Royal mothers were expected to be active in advancing the interests of their sons, and once the sons became rulers and advising them, some on an almost daily basis. In several recent cases, the line of succession was changed, at least partly because of the pressures of a wife. And when rulers were killed, as they often were in the past, the wives took their children to their own families and kept them there until they were old enough to rule. There's much other evidence of the way women were involved in politics, but the point I want to make is that women's invisibility actually enhanced their influence. Women were an unknown quantity to outsiders, and tribes' enemies found it difficult to know how much they would contribute to any confrontation. And typically, the women sided with their husbands, even when conflicts arose with their own families. This suggests that where royal power is involved, conventional wisdom that says family members invariably remain loyal to one another no longer holds true. In the other book, Simple Gestures, the latest book, I continue this Geertzian prescription of stumbling upon general truths through special cases. The book is an account of my everyday experiences living and working in the Middle East. I've tried to make the insights about culture obvious without too many clarifying statements. The reader, in effect, should act as an anthropologist, and if the examples are not convincing, then the insights are not likely to be absorbed in any case. The main dilemma for the anthropologist, as it will be for the reader, is how much information does it take for an insight to seem valid. The anecdotes should accumulate and build as accurate and consistent a picture as possible. In keeping with the theme of women, let me summarize a brief passage from Simple Gestures as an example of the approach. In the late 1990s, UNICEF followed up on my recommendations for Afghan education by funding a series of workshops. 70 Afghan educators worked on the project, preparing textbooks on primary school subjects. The Afghans the Afghans who worked in the workshops were exceptionally dedicated, but 2 women stood out. Preceding the first workshop, the UNICEF coordinator sent out letters calling for Afghans to join the workshop in Peshawar, but on the first day we had no idea who would show up. However, one recruit was waiting in the hotel lobby with her baby, an 11-year-old nephew. Halima had taken a bus from Mazar-e-Sharif 300 miles away to the Pakistani border, walked over the mountains because she had no passport, and continued by bus to Peshawar. She was recently widowed and left 4 other children with relatives. Her nephew served as her male escort, as required by the Taliban at that time, and cared for the baby while she worked. Why had she come? Muna asked. To contribute to my country, she replied. The second woman, Razia, had the same kind of determination. She was a refugee living in Peshawar, where she'd managed to finish high school, teach herself English, and learn computer skills. Her father died in the war, and her mother was determined to preserve Razia's reputation so she could marry respectably. Razia was the clear leader in her writing groups, even while respectfully giving credit to the older males. When the workshop moved to distant Islamabad, her mother refused to let Razia attend because she'd have to stay overnight. Razia negotiated a compromise where she left the house in the morning in time to take the 3-hour bus ride to Islamabad and returned on the bus to Peshawar to reach home before dark. Neither woman felt it unusual to accommodate to these kind of obstacles during the workshop. An anthropologist whose name, unfortunately, I've forgotten, would have explained their behavior in terms of what she called the nice girl construct. What she meant by that was that people of any society placed limits on their own behavior in order to appear as good moral folk to others. In the case of Halima, by bringing along an escort, and Razia by being home each night. Both women pursued their goals by acting within limits that preserved their own and their families' reputations. They felt no resentment and instead saw their accommodations as ensuring their best interests in the long run. Age and situation were another important factor in determining their nice girl behaviors. As a middle-aged mother of 5, Halima had far fewer nice girl norms to live up to than the younger, yet-to-be-married Razia. Although as Americans we may interpret these actions as unduly imposed on the women, we forget that we too conform to our own nice girl and nice boy expectations and set limits on our behavior, different to be sure from those kind of limits, but nonetheless limits. So, to wrap up my talk briefly, the point I'm trying to make in both books is that, among other points, is that women in the region are not the passive victims many Americans imagine them to be. To suggest that they're sidelined because they're less visible in public is to succumb to the Western notion that the public sphere is the only sphere that matters in life. In fact, in the Middle East, family life tends to be more important than public life to both men and women, and both sexes are intensely affected by what happens there. In the words of one anthropologist, Sheila Webster, who studied sex-segregated spaces in Qatar in the Gulf, she said, "Where spaces are segregated, men are prevented from knowing much of what goes on in a sphere that's important to them. Arabs have suggested that perhaps we Westerners are the ones out of balance when we stress public roles over family concerns." The moral of both books is that being respectful of cultures means listening to perspectives we don't necessarily believe in and might not want for ourselves. And there's no way one way of organizing societies, nor should our values necessarily be the ones that always have to dominate the discussion in politics or personal life. Supporting others in their own reforms is one thing, but determining what the ultimate outcome should be is another. Iris Murdoch, in her book OCOC, once wrote about a character: outsiders who see rules and not the love that runs through them are often too ready to label other people prisoners. My final point is that we need to basically have a fuller understanding of Middle East perspectives and culture before we embark on any projects of the kind that impose our own values of political systems or personal systems on the regional people. Anyway, that's where I'd like to stop now. Let me just quote from the title, Simple Gestures. People always ask me where that title comes from, and I got it from Anthony Shadid's book called Night Draws Near, where he says, "I'm drawn by the civilized propriety of the Middle East. Call the tradition hospitality or respect, generosity or decency, but the small, easy-to-ignore gestures add texture and create familiarity. No one," he says, "enters any room anywhere in the Arab world without being greeted. It never happens." And in a sense, culture is that. It's the small gestures, the things that are reiterated again and again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are going to open the floor to questions and comments. And let me start by asking you, as a Middle Eastern woman, I'm asking you this question. If invisibility gave us all the power that we wanted and we could play all the role that was fulfilling for us, then why have we Middle Eastern women been struggling for the last 5 decades or more in some cases, like Iran, for over 100 years, to become visible, to become part of our society, to get equal right, equal access? So how do you explain
How do I
this?
answer that? I'm not really advocating invisibility by any means. But what struck me in the demonstrations concerning Iran was how the American press and people who spoke to me, many people said, look, there are women out there in front, of these demonstrations. And it's part of our stereotyping of them to imply that they are not involved in these kind of things. And I think what I'm actually saying about the UAE women is that we make a lot of assumptions about them because we never see them except when they're totally veiled. We don't realize the life that goes on in the invisible space and the extent to which they actually do have a great deal of influence. And I think it's important for us to know those things before we can actually, we need a more complicated sense of what the culture of the area is before we can help to support the reforms of Iranian women.
Yes, please just wait for the mic, please.
My name is Stephen Shore. I think the first work ever to deal with American cluelessness about foreign cultures arguably is Melville's Benito Sereno. Oh. So I'm always been impressed with the antiquity of this problem, but not being any more optimistic about its solution. And you haven't mentioned two aspects, whether we are more clueless about the Middle East than other areas of the world, and is American cluelessness even worse or better than those of other Western nations?
Well, I think until Edward Said pointed out how wrong some of our views are, we didn't have a clue. We felt that our view was the view, and what we perceived as we went among the people was the accurate one. I think perhaps we're more clueless at this moment, partly because I think we want to believe these things. We're engaged in a war with two basically Muslim nations, and it would be much harder for us to get engaged in these wars if we didn't feel we were bringing some great benefits of the West to the of our civilization to the uncivilized East. And you so often hear the people talking about how we're fighting these wars partly for women's rights in Afghanistan, for example, without a real understanding of it, what's going on there.
Roxana? Yes, Joe.
Thank you very much for your lecture, and I want to reiterate what Haile just said. This is a really breath of fresh air. And just pick up on what the gentleman said. The British soldiers, for example, have been much more respectful of spaces like the mosques in Iraq than have been the Americans. So in some respects, I think Americans are not doing as well as at least Europeans are. I was particularly very impressed because, you can't go to any major airport in the United States and not find a book where Muslim women are the victim. And of course, then there are women like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who acts as a native informant and then becomes so influential with the new conservatives and the Christian right movement. But it's not just the Christian right and the new cons, but there are also the progressive, a part of the progressive, who join on reproducing these stereotypes in the name of feminism, as you eloquently said. And that's partly why I think that a lot of anthropologists working in the Middle East are having a difficult time getting engaged with policy. And my question to you is that how do you actually break that, given that there is so much out there that picks up these native informants who repeat what the mainstream wants to hear?
I think it's extremely hard, but and it's partly that only certain groups of people get a voice in the Western media, and it goes back to what Hugh Pope was saying about editors look for something that confirms what they believe their readers already believe, and so I think it's very difficult. It's interesting, that book Infidel. I resisted reading it for a long, long time. I thought, oh dear, this is really going to make me angry, but I read it, and it's a wonderfully compelling story about her life. But I think her big confusion is she blames everything on Islam. And in a sense, I believe that what she's talking about is culture, really. It's the culture she came from, a specific culture that is used to abusing women and to distorting also the Islamic religion in order to make their point. So I think basically it's a problem with culture in her book and her confusion between culture and religion. But anyway, it's a very interesting book to read if you keep that in mind.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Ladan, and I just have a question about, I think I heard you say Persian Arabian Gulf, and I knew I would get in trouble about that.
Yeah, and that's why I said everything.
And actually, I'm of Iranian descent, and I know, just being from a Persian background, that's a very controversial topic, and I just find it ironic that this is about culture, and I think Iranians in Iran are very, I would say, very heated about the possibility of the name changing, because they're very passionate about
your question,
Persian.
please.
So I was just wondering why you would frame it as Persian Arabian Gulf instead of Persian Gulf, because it sounds like there was a reason for doing that.
If you're talking about the UAE, they are very heated if you don't call it the Arabian Gulf. So by putting all the names together, I was hoping to satisfy everyone and probably satisfied no one. So I understand your complaint, and I know it's a very hot subject, but usually I refer to the Gulf, but in the U.S., you can't do that, or you think about oil spills.
Yes, please. Here, Kate, here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've made me, first of all, thank you also for criticizing the kite runner, which I can't stand for the same reasons you can. Everyone else seems to like it. You've made me feel very guilty for not publishing for the public, or anyone else for that matter. But I wanted to ask you a question, because you talked about someone who is embedded, and there's this whole program of embedding anthropologists among troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. It's been my feeling that most of those, at least everyone I know who's written about it, is not a Middle East specialist. Mm-hmm. So and those of us who are would never do that. Mm-hmm. So how do we overcome that? And I also think there is a field now, public anthropology. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's writing anthropology for the public, and that's growing, and there are meetings in Washington about it. My second question is, how do you think, getting back to what Dr. Esfandiari, sorry for the pronunciation, how does class fit into this in terms of making women, the Middle Eastern women's dislike of perhaps aspects of the traditional roles?
Oh, I think it's so, class is very important. And I don't know if you read, was it the MISA Bulletin that came out with a whole series of articles on, one of them was this Mervet Hatem's article, but also Fida Adli, is that her name? I was very impressed with her article in that, where she talks about how, one thing we keep ignoring is that even though there are all these laws in Morocco about equality within family life and things like that, you find when you had the Minister here of Social Affairs a couple of years ago, she was, I asked her afterwards, I said, how about inheritance? Is that equal? And she said, oh, no, we can't touch that. So in a sense, you get the laws of equality, but you don't fulfill the whole thing with inheritance. But my point, I'm coming to you indirectly, and that is that Fida Adli in this report in the bulletin said she's sure that lower class women would not want equal inheritance with men, because then it would be a problem for them of finding support if they were divorced or their husbands died or something like that. I mean, that what she was saying was that the poor women really need this kind of support, and the sort of legal obligation on men to support women is not something they want to give up so easily. But we have the same problem in the Equal Rights Amendment. We can't get that across, partly because of feminists who have received so many benefits over the years that are directed at women. They don't want to give up these rights in this country either. So it's a similar situation there. So I think that's how I would feel on that.
Yes.
Ted Katuf. I quite agree with you that we shouldn't be running around the world willy-nilly trying to change societal norms, especially in the area as sensitive as gender and the like. It seems to me that women in this country and minorities didn't have outside actors defending them. They fought for their own, they struggled for their own rights, and eventually more or less got their Equal Rights Amendment or not. But when you spoke of the UNDP report on human development in the Arab world, I don't entirely agree, because it seems to me that these people, westernized or not, have pointed out a number of areas that are holding their societies back. Mm-hmm. And right now I'm thinking of education and the fact that in the Middle East, I think it's fair to say you have paternalistic culture, you have authoritarian culture that has a lot of influence on child rearing, and that's their right. But it points out that they're not preparing, that schools are not preparing young people for whatever jobs are being created, and that the economies also are a bit stagnant. And also we know that in economies where women are not participating a lot, the economies don't do so well. So westernized or not, it seems to me they had some, please comment, but it seems to me they had some valid observations.
Actually, I agree with you. I think it was kind of a breakthrough that that you had these Arab authors analyzing their own societies and looking at the problems within them. So actually I was quoting Mervat Hatem and some more critiques that I've read recently about these reports. And probably, you know, most of what they say is valid, but it's sort of the underlying assumption that they will and we will all approach it from a sense of, it's almost like saying a deficit model. Is, you know, how are they different from the development goals that have been set internationally? Could I say about women in education in the Middle East, I agree that the quality of education programs is pretty poor in the public sector, and perhaps it's a lot of that's affecting attitudes and these authoritarian structures in a way. But if you look at, well, I had, if I can remember correctly, I had data on 20 of the Arab countries, and out of the 20, a quarter of them have fewer girls in school than boys. In primary school, 3/4 have either the same number of girls or more girls. And once you get to secondary, it comes out about the same, except that there are more girls than boys in 3/4 of the countries. And once you get to university, overall in the region, you've got many more girls than boys in a lot of the countries. The more conservative the country, the more likely that you'll have high ratios of girls to boys students at the university level. So I think that's also something that's lagged behind. Our officials are always running out and saying, you've got to give your girls the same opportunities as the boys. Well, we should be asking, why aren't the boys getting the kind of university education that the girls are getting now? One of the reasons that we see things this way is that people tend to report this education data in terms of literacy figures. Well, literacy is not telling you what's happening now. It's telling you what happened 20, 30 years ago. And the Middle East region as a whole is the fastest growing enrollment, education enrollment area in the world. So I think we're being unfair to them not to recognize the strides that have taken place in the last few years. Did I answer your question, Ted?
Yeah, it's the quality. I agree that the women are becoming educated, getting equal access in many countries to education. It's the quality for both men and women that is really the problem.
And also, yeah, if you're talking about other indicators like political participation, in every Arab country where men vote, women vote, except Saudi Arabia. In all those countries, they have ministers who are women. The participation rates in the parliament of women in 4 or 5 of those countries is higher than it is in the U.S. Congress and Senate. We have 17% women's representation. Some of the other countries have up to 25%. The statistic where they lag behind is in proportion of the labor force. And I think that's more a consequence of choices as much as anything else, because the women have the skills, but they're a lot of the educated ones are choosing to stay home and take care of their children, especially in the oil-rich countries.
Andrea, I think the reason why in some countries there is a 25% participation of women in parliament, there is only one case, and that's Iraq, and that's because of the Iraqi constitution, which was then, even in Tunisia, it's not 25%. In Morocco, it's not.
No, I'm not saying it's 25, but I'm saying it's in several countries, it's more than the 17%. So you get it in Tunisia, you get it even
in Morocco. It's because of the quota. Yes,
yeah.
It's because of the quota system that is helping the case of women in a number of.
And that's true in general. Is that it's really been the leaders of the country that have often appointed women to these positions, have tried to push it forward. And it's very hard for women still all over the Middle East to become elected to national governments. I didn't mean to imply that they're being highly successful, but just that that they're not being denied this as we seem to think.
Okay, let me ask you I will ask the last question. You talked about the UAE. Do you mind telling us a little bit about Saudi Arabia? And the culture, the problem exactly. How do we face Saudi Arabia when we go there, the culture, and
the culture.
And what sort of problems do we envisage? They're in the other side of the Persian Gulf. So.
Well, it's such a big subject, I don't even know where to start with it. Saudi Arabia is quite often always the exception when you want to talk about elections and you talk about women's involvement. But even they have recently appointed a deputy minister woman for education. And, there's so many factors involved, the historical background where you go back to the link between the Wahhabi religion and the political leaders, and it always surprises people to see that hasn't been broken, that there's a great deal of power in the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia, and somehow the political establishment, the royal family, has been willing to concede a lot of authority to them. But I think the new King Abdullah, everybody says there are little signs that things are changing. There's a new King Abdullah Technical College that he's made co-ed at the university level, which is unusual. And when a religious leader objected, he replaced him. And he's been shown recently in a picture with a group of women, and that's almost never done publicly. And these were at a conference or something of that sort. So, no country stays and remains unchanged. You'll always find changes going on. another thing that King Abdullah has worked on is trying to build more tolerance into the school system and the curriculum. And he's worked on changing. He's changed some of the textbook content to make it more tolerable. I think that one little example is the textbook said to the children in the religious textbooks, it said something like, when you walk into a shop and it's a Christian owns the shop, you don't say salam alaikum to him. You say, good morning, sabah al khair, or something like that. But he's changed it to any person you greet, you should say salam alaikum, and treat them the same as any other, that you should respect all religions and people. And there are some changes going on in the culture there.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Andrea Brooks. There are books for sale outside, and Andrea will sign the books.